right, well, we'll let people join as we go along, but we'll get started for this afternoon so that we can hear the fantastic commentary and research that we've got on offer today through the Women in Economics Society. So firstly, I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today. For me, that's the Wandjabara people. And for those who are interested, that's a parcel of land that goes from Mount Tamborine out to Bow Desert and around the back of the Logan River area. And I'd like to acknowledge the ongoing connection that our First Nation people have to land, community and sea, acknowledge elders past, present and emerging as well. So I'm Natasha Doherty and I'm a director in the WEN Queensland chapter. Really proud to be part of that group of fantastic women that champion the role that women play in the economics field and promote the fantastic work that women do and support our young women that are coming up underneath us as well. So today we have a great panel put together for you. Talking about the impact of COVID across a number of different subject matter areas and also stakeholders that have been affected over this time. There's been a number of reports that have been done on the impact that COVID has had globally and also in Australia in subject matter areas such as mental health, youth justice, the impact it's had on young people and children, the impact it's had on educational results. And so it's really great that we've got three wonderful women here today to talk about the fantastic research that they've done, but also to talk about the impact they think that that research has on the response that government should take in a post-COVID environment, what it means for policy, and also what it means for pandemic responses in the future, and how do we learn from the experience we've had through this COVID pandemic. So I'd really like to start by welcoming each of our three panellists that we have with us today. We're very lucky to have some wonderful researchers and contributors to this space on this panel. So I'll start with Silvia. So Silvia is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Wollongong and also the University of Turin. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of New South Wales and also a master's in economics from the University College of London as well. Sylvia previously worked as a lecturer in economics at the University of Aberdeen and as a research associate at the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW. She's also a research fellow of the Institute of the Study of Labour. So Sylvia's main research interests are in empirical health and labour economics, and she has a strong interest on family wellbeing, education and mobility. And her research is focused on the wellbeing of children and young people and the role of education and health in their lives. So really fantastic to have you with us today, Sylvia, to hear about the great research that you've been doing.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So Stefanie Schurer is our next panellist. So Stefanie is a professor of economics in the School of Economics at the University of Sydney. She's internationally recognised expert in the field of economics of human development and has produced some of the first insights on the stability and determinants of non-cognitive skills over the life course. Her current research program focuses on the impact of public policy on human development, and she's a chief investigator on several of the linked administrative data projects in Australia. So she likes using big data to study the consequences of Australians' key family, welfare and medical policies for children, but specifically focused on our First Nations children as well. Stefanie has been deeply engaged with Indigenous researchers and has undertaken research on Indigenous children in past years, and she leads an NHMRC funded Against the Odds Indigenous Youth Wellbeing Project and has led multiple evaluations on the impact of the Northern Territory's quite controversial income management and alcohol restrictions policies. She's also a co-investigator on several evaluations of the New South Wales Child Protection System, and also a secretary and board member of the International Association of Economic Research for Indigenous People. So fantastic to have you here today, Stefanie, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Fantastic. And our last but not least panelist is Cherie Josephson. She's an experienced policy advisor and strategic planner and management consultant and researcher. So as the manager of the policy and advocacy team at CCIQ, Cherie manages the development of CCIQ's policy submissions and research projects across the broad policy space. So advocating specifically for the interests of small businesses across sectors and regions within Queensland. So Cherie has 15 years experience in research, management and consulting and industry advocacy. And prior to CCIQ, Cherie worked as a management consultant at one of the top 4 accounting and consulting firms, and gained extensive experience in planning and leading economic development and industry strategies, feasibility studies and business case projects, particularly on regional economic development, and in the tourism and leisure projects and strategies across Australia. And then prior to consulting, Cherie was a senior industry policy advisor with the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, and before that was a strategic planning consultant on economic development strategies and planning across regional Victoria. So fantastic to have you here today, Cherie.
Thanks, Natasha. Gosh, when you put it like that, I felt like I have earned an economics degree, even though I'm on a panel with master's and PhD level economists. But, you know, I feel like I've earned my stripes, and hopefully I can contribute something to the conversation today. But thank you so much for having me. Honoured to be here.
No worries. Yep. It sounded like you've done all the sort of stuff that I've done. So I think you're well qualified. All right, so what we're going to do today, we're going to have each of our panelists present, you know, for 10 minutes on the research that they've done, and then we'll open up for a panel discussion after that. So we'd encourage you, if you do have questions as we're going through the presentations, please use the Q&A button down the bottom to provide us with those questions. And then when we open up for the panel discussion at the end, you know, we can go through the questions that you've proposed to the panel. So lucky to go first is Silvia. So look, I'm just going to, without any ado, hand over to you, Silvia, to present on the great research that you've undertaken.
All right. Thanks very much, Natasha. Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. All right. So my research is about impact of COVID-19 pandemic on girls, and in particular on the well-being of girls. And this is joint work with Agnes Susifelite at City University of London and Anna Zhu at RMIT. So a bit of background. We know that COVID-19 has impacted men and women differently. And we know there's quite a lot of research telling us that women have been more severely affected. So we know the lockdowns hurt mothers, working mothers hardly. And in general, we know that the well-being of adult women was more severely affected in the past 2 years. And we also know that the pandemic was bad for kids, kids' mental health and their well-being. However, we felt when we started doing this research that there was not really much said on how this burden was shared between boys and girls. And we thought that this is a very important topic because, of course, establishing gender gaps in well-being after the pandemic can be a very relevant thing to do. So we started with these 2 research questions. We wanted to understand whether the COVID-19 pandemic affected the mental health of boys and girls in a different way. And we were also interested in understanding whether there were any pre-existing circumstances that could protect, that could be buffers against any negative effect. Now, needless to say, this has got, we thought it's got important policy implications, because we know that children's mental health is a key thing, and it spills over many important outcomes later in life, from education to mental health when they grow up, to entering the labor market, and so on and so forth. And of course, if we do find that there are gender differences in well-being after the pandemic, this may be one factor contributing to undermining the possibility to achieve gender equality. So what did we do? We worked with British data, and in particular with a longitudinal study, which simply means a group of families that are interviewed regularly every year. The data that we use is called Understanding Society, and it's a group of British families that are normally surveyed every year. But during COVID, a subgroup of these families was asked to participate in a COVID-specific survey. So they were interviewed every month and then every 2 months, starting from April 2020, so at the very beginning of the pandemic. And we have 10 waves of this COVID survey, plus, of course, all the pre-existing wave, the ones pre-COVID. In this survey, many things are measured, and what we were interested in is the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, which is a tool using to measure children's mental health. So it's a group of questions that covers various things, from hyperactivity to inattention, to inability to concentrate, to emotional symptoms, conduct problems. Kids are asked like how they behave with their peers, their pro-social behavior. So there's a bunch of questions that aim at measuring the mental well-being of these children. So what do we find? What are the main findings of our research? We showed in our paper that girls' emotional and behavioral difficulties increase substantially compared to boys, and these results are noticeable and statistically significant. So if we look at what was the situation before the pandemic, there was no real difference in the well-being by gender. And then during the pandemic, this group of difficulties and emotional and behavioral difficulties increased for girls, but not for boys. This is true across all of the domains of the strength and difficulties questionnaire. So in the emotion side, in the behaviors like hyperactivity and conduct, and in the peer problems. The conduct problems are the only ones who decrease, and that's probably due to school not being there, but they decrease among boys more than among girls. So the questions are asked to kids between 10 and 15. They fill the questionnaire themselves, and that's where we find the more noticeable results. So for the younger kids, the parents fill in the questionnaire, and they talk about the children's symptoms, and we notice that the results are a little bit less clear. We also look at what these kids say about their satisfaction. They ask about their life satisfaction with in different domains, in school, in friends, in their parents. And also in those questions, we find the girls' experience a larger increase in dissatisfaction. And these disparities are really quite noticeable. To give you a sense, they're like the effect of gender and these disparities is more noticeable than, for example, the effect of parental education or age of the children. There also there are some, we ask ourselves, are there any gaps throughout the socioeconomic distribution? And we did find that these differences were noticeable at all different income groups, although they were a bit more relevant in lower income families. And then when we looked at potential buffers, as I was saying before, good pre-pandemic mental health did not really help. So the fact that a kid was in really good state of well-being before the pandemic was not enough to protect her from the disadvantage in the next period, really. Now, why can this happen? Many reasons. We didn't really go into the channels. It's very hard, and we think more research is needed on these. But if we try to speculate on some of the reasons, it could be that girls may have experienced more changes to the day-to-day life. So it may be that they were, needed more in terms of like help with housework, in terms of like looking after little siblings, and they could seeing different, even online, even less for these reasons. It could also be the face-to-face interaction, which was obviously clearly greatly reduced, it's more important for the well-being of girls than for boys. And lastly, and that's something that we are kind of like trying to investigate at the moment is, could be the school act as a reinforcing environment for girls more than for boys. We know from literature that girls tend to outperform boys in many subjects at school. So it could be that they suffer more from online learning and from the lack of interaction with their teachers and their peers. Now we think that a lot more should be done to understand the reasons of these effects and also what a policy can do. But we think that this kind of like subgroups analysis, and in particular looking at differences by gender, is very important. Even when we talk about children, I mean, a lot is usually done in terms of like adult people, but maybe a bit less for young people, because we think that a first step in addressing any future, big shock, could be, pandemic, but could also be other sorts of shock. It's like, it's really important that we know and that we raise awareness among people who work with these children, whether it's parents or teachers or the wide community. It's like, it's really, we believe it's really important to talk about these gaps and to talk about the fact that girls can be suffering more, can be more sensitive to the impact of these sort of shocks. And I think that's it for me. Thanks very much.
That was really interesting, and I'll be interested in our panel discussion to delve into, what you've observed the policy response has been, and whether or not you feel that, some of the issues you've identified as part of your research have been considered by government in terms of how they might better support girls in particular in a post-COVID environment. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go to Stefanie now to hear about some of Stefanie's research she's done within an Australian context. So over to you, Steph.
No, you cannot. Can you hear me well now?
Yes, can hear you well. We're just
perfect.
I'm just
going.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. And thanks, Silvia, for reviewing a little bit the literature and pointing out that some of the evidence in the international literature says that in particular mothers were potentially most harmed by the COVID experience. And I'm going to talk about the plight of in particular mothers in Melbourne's 2020 lockdown experiment. So everything I'm going to say now is going to refer to research that I and many other co-authors have done. And I will honor my co-authors by name in a second, once I come to the studies themselves, where we have evaluated Australia's second lockdown, which was Melbourne's 2020 lockdown experiment. So I talk about the time period of roughly July to end of October, early November 2020. And so what I'm going to say is that lockdowns have clearly affected mothers most in surprising and unsurprising ways. So let me go into that for a second. So what you should know about Melbourne's zero COVID strategy is that it led to Melbourne being, as you can see in this chart here, the richest country in the world with the longest consecutive lockdown. So the greater Melbourne area that you can see here in this histogram here, where you see on the horizontal axis the total number of the countries ranked, or the jurisdictions ranked by the number of total days in lockdown since January 2020. So since the onset of the pandemic. And what is not in this graph yet is the current Shanghai or other Chinese jurisdictions lockdown. So this is data up until June this year. It doesn't include yet the Shanghai experience. So Shanghai being, or some other jurisdiction in China being, the last countries in the world that still pursue this zero COVID strategy. So, but Melbourne has been straight up there. You see other countries like England had lots of lockdowns, and even the greater Sydney area had lots of lockdowns, but Melbourne had in total 267 days. And we talk about the long lockdown of 111 days in 2020. And when you think about lockdowns and you want to analyze this, you always have to think about these trade-offs that lockdowns have. So here, this is from a study by Besley and Stern from 2020 in Fiscal Studies, an article I really recommend you to read if you're interested in these trade-offs. It's really about protection of incomes, which a lot of laissez-faire economists would have talked about, versus lives saved. So Australia was very strong on its objective to save lives and has done very successfully up until early 2020. And you think these trade-offs here, production possibility frontier, of course, countries will be somewhere in between, not at the extremes, but Melbourne or the Victorian jurisdiction really took it to the extremes, the first rich country in the world to really pursue a zero COVID strategy, which means if you have an increase in infection numbers, you really want to suppress these numbers as quickly as possible by minimizing social mobility or mobility until the daily new infections are down to practically zero. But that will come at the high cost of protection of income. But when you think about these trade-offs, they're not quite as easy. When you think about the costs and benefits of avoiding disease, death, and self-protection behaviors, you cannot just think about protection of incomes. That's more symbolic for a host of outcomes. So you can think about not just the economic loss, but future debt. There's a lot of fiscal transfers and mental ill health or other outcomes, such as maybe loneliness, which may affect mental health, or as Silvia talked about, learning loss in children, and maybe a loss of connection to your communities and so on. And I will talk about some of these outcomes in more detail. And what has been strong in the literature early on, already in 2020, were these fears that lockdowns will affect individuals differently. And it was thought that the rich, the healthy, maybe professional workers in more wealthy regions will be less affected by lockdowns because workers have more autonomy over the time and where they can work. Whereas highly populations in highly densely populated areas or where you have less personal space will be more affected, or workers who have less autonomy at the workplace. And so early in the discussions were the very poor, the mothers, because of the homeschooling component, the very young and the lone and the frail. So we looked at that. We looked at Melbourne's lockdown experiment, and it turns out to be the perfect natural experiment. And we can talk about the scientific value of the experiment. But what I can tell you is the experiment is so clean because it was a very long and hard lockdown. It was not coincided with a great loss of life already, because the lockdown happened very early when there was less than around 100 daily new infections and hardly any deaths, and any death occurred really in very old populations. And it wasn't accompanied by the economic loss that you've seen in other countries because of the immediate transfer of fiscal transfers, of cash transfers and job seeker payments and job keeper payments. And that meant that the lockdown was quite clean. And what was also clean is that the HILDA, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey of Australia, was collected exactly during this lockdown period, where Melbourne was in lockdown, the Greater Melbourne area, and then later the Greater Victorian area, whereas other jurisdictions in Australia were not locked down at all and people could move freely. And the borders were closed fairly quickly between New South Wales and Victoria, and then also to South Australia. So people couldn't really move around and avoid the lockdown quickly. So it's from a scientific perspective, a very valuable natural experiment. And so we have produced as a team 2 studies. One is published already in the Lancet Public Health, together with Peter Butterworth from ANU, Trong An Trinh, Esperanza Vera Toscano, and Mark Wooden from the Melbourne Institute. And in the first paper, we only looked at mental health, because mental health was considered to be the main negative outcome, the collateral damage of this lockdown objective to save lives. And what you can see here is, I'm just going to show you some results. The results on mental health, when you look at the survey years here from 2011 to 2020, there was this pre-COVID period, and you look at the rest of Australia, mental health did go down in Australia over time, at least in the Hilda survey, up until 2019. And then something happened here, the lockdown experiment, and you see in Victoria, mental health dropped quite a lot in a statistically significant way, different from the rest of Australia. That's here. The red dot is for the rest of Australia, and the blue dot is for Victoria. And then you see that, well, mental health did decline for everyone, but much more so for people in Victoria. And so we exploited this natural experiment. So we, in the paper, it's difference methods that we're exploiting here. And please read the paper or talk to me in private about the methods, or we can do this, of course, also in the discussions. But what is important, what came out, we looked in this heterogeneity analysis of these results, was that we figured out in the analysis that's only some groups which were affected, and it was not the groups that we initially thought. So there was a discussion about all the young people here, the 15 to 19-year-olds, and for them, we didn't find any statistically significant results. So the overall treatment effect was roughly 2-point change on a mental health scale from 0 to 100. That was roughly 0.19 standard deviations, so not so much. But it was really the mid-age groups, females, and not so much the males at all. And when you look at the family structure here in panel B, you figure out that most of these results are driven by women, that's the red dot here, with a 95% confidence intervals, with young dependent children. Young dependent children means here kids younger than 15 years of age. And it's really, I mean, there are effects in other groups too, right? Like coupled households with young dependent children, but it's really driven by these mothers. And it is driven also by families that live in mobility restrained households, like flats or apartments that have less space. And what you also see, it's really driven by the major city, like in Melbourne itself. And these results, we have produced them in sync with another paper that I'm going to introduce you to, is a second paper, which we called initially Zero COVID Policies, Melbourne 112-day hard lockdown experiment harmed mostly mothers. So in the same paper, we looked, also co-authored by Mark Wooden in the Speranza Vera Toscana, but also with Kadir Atalay, an associate professor in my School of Economics, and Nick Glosier, a professor of psychological medicine, where we look at lots of different domains of human outcomes, like different health components, health behaviors, social connectedness, and labor supply and income. And what you see here is all these treatment effects that we have estimated separately for males and females. And when you look at the overall sample, you actually don't find so much. You see that, and this is unexpected, the females started exercising more. So by almost 0.3 standard deviations, they increased the frequency of the physical exercise. And that's true among almost all women. And for men, you see that overall they feel less part of the local communities. So these are very sound treatment effects. They don't go away, whatever would we do. And for both male and female, we see these very modest mental health effects that you see up here. But it's really the music plays in the heterogeneity result. And this is a big graph that I want to show you. What you see is in different domains, different outcomes. So each row is a different domain: health behavior, social connectedness, labor supply and income. And what you see is that it's really the mothers with young children. It's these red dots that you see. So I'm highlighting these effects. And for them, we find they dropped significantly their mental health. They dropped significantly the general health. They also increased their frequency of physical activity, but that was true for almost all women. They also felt safer. The only group that did so in a statistically significant way, but they also felt more lonely in a statistically significant way. And they did reduce the work hours. And you do not see the same effects for fathers. And for fathers, the only statistically significant effect that we find is that they increase the frequency of alcohol consumption. You also see that they drop their mental health, but not in a statistically significant way. And they also increase their loneliness, but none of the treatment effects that we saw for mothers. And what we also saw for these mothers, that some of these effects either go away over the exposure time of the lockdown. So here you see over for groups that were interviewed early in the lockdown, in the middle of the lockdown, and at the end of the lockdown. And these mental health effects you see for these mothers with children really only in the first half of the lockdown. But the general health effects, they dropped general health over time, and they increased their BMIs over time. So they got, even though they did more physical exercise, they seem to have become quite a little bit heavier. And the work hours, they also reduced over time of the lockdown. So the lockdown didn't hit people immediately in the first month, but the longer the exposure had more negative effects. So why is this the case? You will ask, why is it the mothers? We didn't find any impact on the partner dissatisfaction. It just didn't show up in the data. And they also felt safer. So we don't think that in the Hilda sample, it's driven by domestic violence, the presence of a partner who may drink more alcohol. Well, the Melbourne residents were also not more affected by COVID. We see this clearly in the data. There was a special COVID module. And the Melbourne residents were also not more negatively affected by the first lockdown. We can see this in their household incomes from the previous financial year. So it's not that. So what we really think is what Leah Rupana has termed the mental load increase with the homeschooling. These mothers just worked potentially 2 jobs, the job at home, homeschooling the kids, and potentially continuing to work still, albeit with reduced work hours in a daily job. And what can be done? Well, it's very hard to say, because I don't think we will ever go back to lockdowns of these dimensions. I think this will not happen again. The zero COVID strategy will not happen again. But I thought, if mothers worked potentially 5 to 6 hours extra in the home to homeschool their kids, plus worked maybe a part-time job, they worked at least two hours more per day than what would be acceptable in a full-time job. Maybe they should be compensated. So I thought that, I personally think this, not everyone on the research team thinks this, maybe a cash transfer to families through the ATO, through your tax returns, maybe that would be a valuable approach. I stop here. We can have more discussions. Thank you.
Oh, it's fantastic, Stefanie. I have so many questions, but mostly I wonder whether those young mothers, the mothers with young children, increasing their physical activity is just a mechanism for them to get outside away from their kids to have a break. But anyway, we can talk about that a little bit more when we come back to the panel. All right, I am going to move now to Cherie, and this is a bit of a different angle Cherie's got. So she's going to talk to us about the impact COVID has had on small businesses. Over to you, Cherie.
Thanks very much, Stefanie. I just need to get you to stop sharing so I can share my screen. Perfect, thank you. I'll put my video on. Hello, everybody. So a bit of a different take on the conversation today, sharing a business perspective on the impact of COVID, particularly Queensland business perspective. So I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager for the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland, and a big part of my role is not only research but also advocating directly to the Queensland Government about how they can best support business. And as you can imagine, over the last couple of years, that's been quite a big job and an ever-evolving role as well. What I'm going to present today is essentially a bit of a story time of what our Pulse survey of business conditions have found, and can detail more of our research and other thought leadership work we've done in the panel conversations. But we've been running this survey for over 20 years, and what this enables us is to see how we expect confidence to rebound. We can see how drastic a situation is compared to previous disruptions on our economy as well. So I'll be sharing the latest research, which was from the September quarter. And just something to keep in mind is the way that the Pulse business indexes are structured is 50 is neutral, and above or below 50 would indicate that a indicator has grown or fallen respectively. So I've also provided a bit of a comparison to pre-COVID levels as well, to give you a bit of a sense of how sentiment has changed over time. So I'm going to start with our high level data, which is the 12-month outlook, essentially business confidence in the national and Queensland economies. And this chart is fascinating to stare at for hours on end. Essentially what you're looking at is back in late 2008, early 2009, we have the GFC, and we can see the confidence in the state and the national economies just sink to record lows. Over time, you can see where it steadies out, and it does typically fall below the line because that's typically what a business sentiment survey will find. It will generally trend below the line, but we can see that in early 20, we can see how sharp that fall in confidence was. It was a historic low as well, lower than what we saw from the impacts of the GST, and it was much more severe as well in terms of the sudden drop. And had quite a long way to climb back up into positive territory. Really interesting, though, is what we saw in early 2021. All of 2020 was really quite poor. It was significantly poorer most quarters, but progressively less so, which is what it's showing here. But in 2021, really, when the vaccination program was being discussed in media, we saw a real lift back up into positive territory, and it maintained itself there for a few quarters. Unfortunately, what sank it was around the same time as the December 17 border reopening, because we also had the Omicron virus come along with that. And unfortunately, a lot of businesses, particularly those that were hopeful for a strong summer after quite a dismal last 18 months, didn't have that realised, and it sank back down. It did have a bit of a rebound the following quarter, but where we are now is not in a particularly great position, and hopefully I'll be able to explain why that is. We were hoping that it would rebound back up and we'd fall back into what is a more historic trend, so just bouncing around underneath 50, but at the moment it's crashed again. This is in contrast to improving business conditions, though, and historically what we'd see is that business conditions and confidence would trend alongside one another. So an increase in general business conditions would mirror an increase in confidence. The last 2 quarters, however, in Queensland, we've actually seen a decoupling of that. We've seen improved business conditions, but drastically reduced confidence. And here I'll start to spell out the reasons why that is. So here I'm comparing the index scores from September 2019, so pre-COVID era for a September quarter, versus the latest data in September 2022. And we can see here that most of the indexes were in satisfactory. So I haven't got anything in red except the general business conditions. Typically, we would see general business conditions in a September quarter a little bit low, but with an outlook a bit more optimistic as well, which is what we're seeing here. It's in satisfactory position. Compared to what we're seeing now, we have crashed out on confidence, unfortunately, and it's sitting really quite low in very low weak categories, but general business conditions has improved and improved again on previous quarters as well. What we're seeing is that sales and revenue has recovered. So we're now seeing businesses having more cash through their tills. We're seeing more people out on footpaths, more people going out and shopping. But what is really holding back, and this is the most important piece, is the impact of the last 2 years is ongoing rising operating costs. So consistently high, but also increasingly high each quarter operating costs, and labor costs as well. And that's holding back their profitability. So we can see, on a day-to-day basis, they're feeling good because they've got cash flow, but they're paying their bills and they can't get staff, and they're realizing that they're not actually making a lot of money. And so their confidence in the broader macro issues are really holding back confidence in the economy. Employment levels are lower than what they used to be, but it's actually considered satisfactory, although we do know that that people are expensive at the moment, and it's really hard to find skilled staff as well, which is really holding back growth as well. Interestingly, capital expenditure, however, has tipped above the line. So businesses are now just recently willing to start investing back into their business. So this is a really unique variety of scores that we wouldn't typically see in the Pulse survey of business conditions, and probably not something that we're going to see going away anytime soon, because a lot of these are driven by those macro issues as well. So as I was saying before, sales and revenue have improved. And what we're seeing here is the research from the question from our survey: at which level is your business currently operating compared to March 2020? So essentially, has your business got the same sort of operating capacity or getting the same level of sales, for example, through your business as it was pre-pandemic? And we can see back in September 2021, businesses on average in Queensland felt they were only about 3/4 of the way there. In just recently, in the last few quarters, we've seen on average businesses saying, yeah, we're now back at the levels that we were operating back in March 2020. So you can imagine how disheartening that must be for businesses that, you know, invest so much into their business, majority of these being small and medium-sized businesses, the majority of these being linked to the family budget as well. They've really lost a couple of years of growth, and they've only just now regained ground. Unfortunately, though, we're seeing this drop off of confidence. This is confidence in reaching their 12-month business goals. So on a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you in reaching your 12-month business goals? It would typically trend around 6 or 7. And we've seen this to be really quite low throughout COVID. And it's just started to reduce again as we've seen the confidence in the national and the state economies also sink. So unfortunately, while we're seeing business conditions in good territory and we're seeing sales and revenue in good territory, unfortunately, confidence is being hit on their own business goals now as well. Something we've also been tracking in the business survey is mental health concerns of business owners and also their employees. So back in December, we knew that this was an increasing issue. We were hearing it from across our Queensland business networks and our regional chamber networks as well, that mental health challenges was really impacting the productivity, but also just the day-to-day wellness of workers and business owners themselves. So we put in a question into our survey: have you or anyone in your business recently been impacted by mental health challenges? And this was a really stark finding. 64% of respondents said yes. This was ahead of the Southeast Queensland flooding event, but it was really important research that we had up our sleeve going into a natural disaster on top of an already existing health crisis and an economic crisis as well, because we were able to say to the Queensland government, hey, look, we've now got this research saying that Queensland businesses are already really hurting and their workers are already really hurting. A natural disaster on top of this is not good. Make sure that when you have a recovery package for business, that you are taking mental health really, really seriously in those support packages. It has gradually improved, but in this recent quarter, we did see a bit of a jump up again, over 50% still saying yes. And this last slide here from our survey is showing what the key constraints on business growth are. And the top 2 are all about labour force. So retaining and recruiting employees, keeping on to good workers, and trying to find workers with the right skill sets has been really difficult for a lot of businesses. I don't think that will change without a real focused effort on training, but also international migration will plug a big gap there as well. direct wage costs in this competitive market is a real constraint as well. And recently we've seen insurance premium costs just gradually climb the ladder, and it's now sitting at in the top 3 of a major constraint on business growth moving forward. And we're actually seeing anecdotally from businesses that they're either uninsurable or underinsured for a lot of issues, or having to scale down their operations. So we're seeing some real challenges for business. Really at the top of the list are workforce issues, both in terms of, being productive and having the right skills in order to do the work, but also that more social aspect of the role that businesses are now appreciating that they need to play in the broader wellness of their workers as well, and also, looking after themselves in tough times.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cherie. Fantastic presentation, and be very interesting to see where that index goes over the next, almost quarter, and then on into the next year as well. As we all are aware, there's a little bit of uncertainty around where we're heading, and that'll be a key indicator for us in terms of, where that's going. All right, so we bring the panel back together now and to start a conversation around all of the wonderful work they've done. Again, I'd encourage you to use the Q&A to submit questions that you might have of the panel. And there's a great one that Emma has put forward, and I noticed, Silvia, you've given Emma a little bit of an answer to that. But yeah, Emma asked a great question around how much research into NAPLAN results have changed in the cohorts pre and post COVID with the different year levels. Do you want to expand on any of that, Silvia, in terms of sort of what you've looked at there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. That's obviously a really nice and topical question. So as I was saying, we're just starting to get results, to get data in terms of test scores around the world for kids that took tests after COVID. So I think that's definitely an area where we want to do more. There's already evidence that tells us about learning losses. I know there is in Italy. I know people who are working with the perspective of NAPLAN test scores in Italy, and it would be very interesting to see if there are gender effects in those test scores. So we know that girls tend to outperform boys in most subjects apart from math, where we still have got quite a noticeable gender gap, and that's another very interesting avenue of research. So it would be nice to see what happened during the pandemic, if the girls suffered more, as these gaps, for example, in maths open even more, and what happened to the other subjects where girls typically do better than boys. So I think that's still very much open. I don't have an answer to that, but that's definitely relevant as well, probably to mental well-being throughout the pandemic as well as after, because of course, satisfaction with school and schoolwork can play a very important role. So I think that's all open.
Can I say something to this? Because this is such an important question. So from the US, we have some results already, and the learning loss. So I just read about it in the New York Times, has reported quite a lot about 9-year-olds learning loss, and the results that come out there is mainly in mathematics. And the learning loss is much larger than has ever been seen between any 2 years in a 30-year time period since these measures have been collected. And what the explanation was that you don't see this so much in reading because families are still at home and read to their kids, right? So it's much easier as a parent to open up a nice fiction or dogman or whatever the kids want to read. I have a 9-year-old, and because you can do this. And so the learning loss in reading, literacy is not so high, but in mathematics, you really need to sit down, and this is so hard to do. So Christian Gillitzer, a senior lecturer in my School of Economics, has presented recently some preliminary evidence on NAPLAN in Australia and doesn't find any impact. So he doesn't see the learning loss. And so this is maybe not the final version of the paper yet. We're not sure, but this preliminary evidence says there is not the same learning loss as you have seen in the US context.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thanks for adding that, Stefanie, in terms of, that different perspective. Well, I might ask you a question, Stefanie, around your research. I was really interested in, the different variations of the living conditions that people had, both in terms of location or dwelling and, all of those other factors. But I wondered whether you did any collective analysis on the overall impact that, the combination of different factors of all of those elements had overall, and what that looked like at a collective level.
So you mean now, for instance, mothers in apartments?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a little bit tricky. So we have done a lot of this analysis, and you can say this is like a fishing exercise. We did an exploratory heterogeneity analysis. And so in the Lancet paper that's now published, is we could do this because we took the Victorian experience and compared it to everyone else in the country. So we weren't so strict on the control group. And where we could drill it down to is that, for instance, the mental health declined most for mothers in like these restricted living areas. We didn't, like, the music really didn't play so much and you could think of mothers with a mental health issue, maybe a young mother in an apartment somewhere in the middle of Melbourne. No, we didn't do like multiple, but we see mothers in combination with restricted living space is the killer. And it's very natural, right? Because females need a little bit of space for themselves, right? It's like you have your periods. I mean, I know it's a difficult conversation. You have a week maybe where you don't feel so well. You want to have a bit of space. And that I consider is really problematic. But we didn't write it as that in these papers, these combinations, because you get into this trouble of smaller sample sizes.
Yeah, absolutely. Cherie, I was wondering about how you think small and medium businesses are managing with the changing expectations that workers have for how they'll both engage with work, but also where they expect work to fit within their lives. So is there anything from sort of the work that you've been doing with small to medium businesses on their experiences there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big topic, and it's one that we get questions from journalists about all the time. There's a lot of conversation about working from home still, and the conversations that we're actually having with businesses are about remote working and flexible working arrangements, not working from home. It's a much broader conversation than that. And I think there has been a shift in how we work and the expectation of both employers and employees about how we work as well, and also making work meaningful, making sure that we're fostering good connections, but that we're also able to develop within a role as well. And that's been a really big shift over the last couple of years. And you can imagine that this is quite a normal sort of trend, a normal sort of thing in a large institution or a large company, but it looks different in a smaller business, and small business owners already wear a lot of hats. And now they're having to start to think about, the mental well-being of their staff and themselves and their families, the expectations of how they're going to grow in their role, how their workers are going to grow in their role, whether they need to reassign job roles and responsibilities because they can't find the right staff. And also, because there is a really critical workforce shortage, we're also having conversations with businesses about how they can more proactively become more inclusive and more pro-diversity in their workplaces as well. And that sounds like a very normal thing in a professional setting, which I think a lot of us might be familiar with, but it looks very different in a manufacturing factory, and it looks very different in some industries that typically haven't had high diversity scores. And so the last couple of years have really shaken up how we work, how we expect to work, but also the current workforce crises have also meant that businesses are needing to rethink their strategy around all of that as well.
And I think it links in quite well to the work that Stefanie and Silvia have done, doesn't it? Like a diverse workforce, and we're talking in the Women in Economics Network, brings sort of better opportunities for individuals to contribute, but also contributes to acknowledging the value of women within society, and then the role that they play in the economy. So it sort of ties nicely together, all of the presentations that you've made today. I wouldn't mind just one more comment, given we've got 2 minutes left, from each of you around, you know, what's your takeaway from the research that you've undertaken, and what's the change that we need to take as a policy agenda, you know, or something that's come out of your research that you'd really like to see either government or businesses to really advocate for and push for? Stefanie, I see you've got your hand up, so do you want to go first?
Yeah, I wanted to ask something different, but we have so little time. So my take-home message is that it is quite important to restrict mobility when we have big infection rates, and so a flexible workplace solves a lot of problems. For instance, less infections when people have the flu, and a willingness to stay home if you are a walking infectious vehicle. That's okay. And so that also means there's less traffic, you're more flexible when you have childcare duties. I think this is a great insight, but I want to come back to my idea of compensating mothers for what has happened in the past. I think the next cash transfer should happen is a cash transfer, a pampering package to these mothers, because at some point in the Sydney lockdown, I calculated how many extra hours I had to do at home, homeschooling plus a full-time job I had to do. And then I suddenly realized, but that's like, I don't know, $500 extra per day. Why do I need to do this? And we know from a lot of research that the fathers did this less. The general attitudes have shifted, even on the continental European continent, a lot, that we expect the moms to do this. And I think it would be advisable to compensate for that a little bit.
Fantastic. Silvia, what's your takeaway?
Oh yeah, I agree 100% with what Steph said. My takeaway message is that we need to be aware. We need to be aware of these gaps. And it's really important that we have clear ideas that these gaps are going to happen. Now, when the pandemic hit, nobody could worry about anything else. Nobody could worry about mental health. Things just happened too fast for someone to realize, and everybody was worried about saving lives and keeping people home. And now we know that there were huge mental health costs for everybody, for adults, but for women in particular, and for girls. So we need to know that this is what happens, so that we put in place strategies to help these women, to help these girls, whether this is counseling, whether this is online programs that people can join, and of course funds for all of these. We need to know that women and girls have suffered more, and we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Fantastic. And Cherie, you've got the last word.
The last word, gosh. I think, just based on the research that I presented, one of the real big things holding back Queensland business is the current workforce crisis. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but coupled that with how we've changed how we work over the last couple of years, where we're working with new technologies, we're automating more processes, we have different expectations of how we work. We're having conversations with the Queensland government at the moment about how the approach to workforce planning needs to change. In the past, it has been very much looking at the occupation and the apprenticeships training required. There's an acknowledgement by businesses that those training programs aren't always job ready, and that they need to be more flexible and adaptable to the needs of the day. So I think focusing on skills and the tasks required, both from a Queensland government strategic planning perspective, but also within the workplace as well. It's not just looking at what a person's qualifications are on paper, but their experience, their passion, their motivations, and whether that can be nurtured within a business. And that hopefully will round us back nicely to making people happy and well in the workplace.
Fantastic.
And community.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your wonderful, diverse opinions, but also how that sort of came together in a melding of thinking about how we shape our economy and how we have good employment policy that is inclusive and diverse and thinks about the flexibility of providing opportunities for all. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Stefanie, Silvia and Cherie. Really appreciate you making the time. Thank you for those of us who are able to join. And we'd like to say from when our last event for the year. Hope you've enjoyed the content that we've brought you this year, and we'll be back next year with more exciting work. So please stay tuned and yeah, look forward to seeing you. Thank you, everybody.